Estimates vary, but from something like the late 1500s to the early 1800s, about 1 million white men, women and children were taken and held as slaves in the states of North Africa, known during this time as the Barbary States, this being the Barbary Coast. The Barbary pirates or corsairs harassed European and North American shipping throughout the Mediterranean and North Atlantic. They periodically landed in European coastal towns and villages, mostly in Spain and Italy, rounded up as many whites as they could find, and took them back in chains to the Barbary slave markets. In 1625, they captured Lundy Island in the Bristol Channel, raised the Islamic flag, and used it as a base to attack villages along the Cornish coast. In 1622, they even made their way as far as Iceland, anchored at Reykjavik, and took 400 of the locals. In this way, during these 2.5 centuries, around 5,000 white Europeans and North Americans were fed into the Barbary States every year, replacing those lost to disease, starvation, exhaustion and murder. Your life as a slave depended on who bought you. Many owned by the ruling pashas or governors of Barbary kingdoms were employed as galley slaves, chained to an oar, and used to row corsair vessels until death or insanity took them. In Morocco, the Sultan Moulay Ismail insisted on owning the majority of slaves himself, employing them on colossal building projects in the new capital, Meknes. Upon arrival at one of the major slave markets, a huge heavyweight chain would be fixed to your leg, then a forced march to the capital. If any should die during the journey, their heads might be cut off and given to you to carry in the blazing heat, to be presented to the Sultan upon arrival at the capital, as proof none were sold elsewhere or allowed to escape. In Meknes, you would be housed in overcrowded slave pens, the floor covered in urine, feces, lice, fleas, mould and cockroaches. Your filthy and rotting woolen rags stank. Your food, a small portion of rancid black bread and a drop of oil. The one bucket placed in the corner overflowing with diarrhea, maggots and flies. If sick, most would simply drop dead, their malnourished, overworked, dehydrated and beaten bodies unable to cope with the extra strain. If you could stand, you could work. If not, care could be provided in the small infirmary paid for by the King of Spain, and run by a handful of Franciscan monks. The Sultan guaranteed their safety so long as the Spanish king continued to pay the necessary protection money. For those lacking motivation to get better, the threat of a visit from the local quack doctor might provide the requisite incentive. One treatment for pains in the body being a red-hot iron rod pressed to the troublesome area. And then, 15-hour days in the African sun, building the massive palace complex for the Sultan, its 7-metre thick walls stretching for miles. The Sultan himself took great care to inspect the building works, personally overseeing the project each day, either on horseback or via a chariot pulled by his eunuchs and wives. And with him came the prospect of random torture and death. His slaves, courtiers and subjects all lived in constant fear of the Sultan's homicidal mood swings. Any provocation, whether real or imagined, for example a quick glance at one of his wives, or else failing to prostrate yourself in the dirt with the necessary enthusiasm, might be answered with a simple beheading, or worse. He was surrounded by 30 black slaves, all teenagers who had been schooled from childhood in blind loyalty and violence. Themselves no less subject to the murderous whims of the Sultan, they nevertheless inhabited a strata above the white Christians labouring beneath them. Thousands were stationed throughout the kingdom, acting as the Sultan's personal army, enforcing his majestic rule upon the populace. As his bodyguard, they beat the white slaves to work faster and harder, and, when ordered, killed them. A particular favourite method was called tossing. The offending slave would be thrown high in the air to land on the hard ground. The Sultan would specify how often this should be repeated, and whether the slave should be made to land on the neck, which of course would break, or whether a simple dislocated shoulder or broken arm would suffice. Some relief was possible. Renounce your Christian faith and become a Muslim. Many, of course, did this. They were called renegades, about 15,000 in the Barbary at any one time. Of course, you remained a slave, and the Sultan might beat and kill you at any given moment. But to turn Turk did mean an easier life. Out of the slave pens, perhaps a new job as an overseer, or to work as a palace attendant. And many were forced, often being tortured for months on end until turning apostate. In 1723, a Christian woman had died from her injuries refusing to renounce her faith. She had had her breasts burnt and molten lead thrown onto her vagina. Periodic attempts were made by the European nations to free their countrymen. Often emissaries would be sent to buy back as many slaves as they could, sometimes successfully, often not. And this too was not without risk. In 1735, the British mission ended in failure when, growing tired of the persistent requests for the British captors to be freed, the Sultan had the Jewish interpreter they had brought from London burned alive. In the end, what was required was force. In the latter half of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th, a succession of treaties were signed between the European powers, the United States, and the Barbary kingdoms to put an end to white slavery. The final act of this period being the 1816 British bombardment of Algiers, always the site of the largest concentrations of European slaves, by Sir Edward Pellow, him being a member of the Society of Knights Liberators of the White Slaves of Africa, a kind of lobbying group created to pressure the European powers to settle the issue. It was, and the trade in white slaves deteriorated thereafter. Thanks for listening. If you like this, subscribe and comment below.